Alright, you guys, this episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Misery and Mayhem, Mongols vs. Mayhem. The Mongols are one of the most respected and revered motorcycle clubs in the world. Even on the home turf of one of the most infamous motorcycle clubs like the Hells Angels, this organization quickly carved itself a path to national attention because of the violence and ruthlessness that has characterized it. From its home base in Southern California, the gang eventually grew to encompass 14 national chapters and sister groups throughout different parts of the world. For all intents and purposes, the Mongols are a powerful organization, an organization that's been known to mount up and have the ability to destroy the majority of other MCs and even other gangs that it's clashed with in the past. But despite the fact that the Mongols had established itself as one of the strongest and most powerful motorcycle clubs in the world, and despite the fact that they were as feared as they were, getting into conflicts with other powerful motorcycle clubs or other criminal organizations could still be detrimental and counterproductive for them as a prospering group, especially a criminal organization like the Mexican Mafia. When you take a minute to put it into perspective, it doesn't seem practical that these two groups would clash. One is a prison organization that theoretically operates both behind the walls of the California state prison system and on the streets, and the other is a motorcycle club that operates on the streets throughout different parts of the world. So how could a conflict develop between these two groups? How did an MC like the Mongols find itself in the crosshairs of one of the strongest criminal enterprises like the Mexican Mafia? And what stopped things from escalating to the point of a full-fledged bloodbath? Although there were recent reasons why a conflict would escalate between these two groups, the origins of their original long-standing conflict can be traced all the way back to the MC's early days to the end of the 1960s. Back in the late 1960s, a small group of Hispanic war veterans who had come back from Vietnam began floating and entertaining the idea of joining a motorcycle club. The Hells Angels were already a strong MC that was still in the building process, and there were a lot of guys who wanted to be a part of this new growing biker movement. It was a culture that was just beginning to evolve, and every young roughneck who considered themselves to be somewhat of an outlaw wanted to ride a tricked out bike and be part of the camaraderie. This growing group of Hispanic war veterans that had aspirations to join an MC sought interest in the Hells Angels as they seemed to be doing everything right. They were growing exponentially. They had some of the baddest bikes, they had the women, and they had the muscle. But this would all get cut short. The Hells Angels' own self-promoted asinine policies prohibited them from prospecting outside of the white race. They implemented these doltish policies that set clear racial boundaries, as this was in line with the racial disparities that were playing out on center stage all across the country at that time. So the Hispanic war veterans decided to create their own MC. In December of 1969, the Mongols Motorcycle Club was founded in Montebello, California. The Mongols took their name from the roaming horde of warriors that conquered most of Asia and Eastern Europe during the 13th century. The club adopted a three-piece patch with the Mongol warriors sporting a Fu Manchu-style mustache riding a motorcycle. It claimed California as being their home turf. Loyalty, honor, and respect were immediately considered as integral components of their existence. After its foundation, the newly formed group almost instantly started to grow in numbers. The veterans that made up its core quickly transformed what was at first just a band of ragtag bikers into a well-designed, disciplined machine. In fact, their membership and requests to join skyrocketed. And only in a handful of years, the Mongols managed to spread far past their hometown in Southern California. By the end of the 1970s, the club had firmly established the support of several chapters throughout California and had rightfully earned its place as a one-percenter club. The sudden spurt of growth that the Mongols went through didn't, however, go unnoticed. While California's biggest MC, the Hells Angels, had merely tolerated their activities up until this point, the club's ability to quickly put up additional chapters and expand was now turning the group into a nuisance. The Hells Angels were watching and they didn't like what they were seeing. On top of that, the fact that both groups now claimed California and that the Mongols openly chose to wear a California bottom rocker made an ensuing conflict practically inevitable. As I pointed out in one of my recent profiles titled Hells Angels vs. Mongols, Since its inception, the Hells Angels have always tried to control and manage all the other MCs across the nation. Everything from what color you can wear, who can wear bottom rockers, what you can represent on bottom rockers, who's allowed to form new MCs, and some of the idiosyncrasies, customs, and traditions that MCs live and die by. But wearing a bottom rocker with the state of California across it was something that the HA strongly prohibited other MCs from doing, because this was the patch that they wore to show their preeminence in the state. And once the Mongols openly defied this policy and let it be known that they were going to be wearing their new California state bottom rocker, there was no averting the conflict between the two clubs from that point on. All-out war would soon follow afterwards. The conflict between the Mongols and the Hells Angels would soon highlight the importance of numbers. Almost immediately outnumbered, the Hispanic club turned to the MCs that had not sworn their allegiance to the Hells Angels for help. A flimsy network of loose alliances was created between the Mongols, Outlaws, Vagos, and other clubs teaming up to keep the white supremacist recruitment efforts at bay. At the same time, the Mongols also began to boost recruitment efforts, hoping that lowering standards and including people from diverse backgrounds could somehow bolster their own numbers. The recruitment drives and alliance brokering worked in the short term, helping the Mongols to survive for the most of the 1980s. By the early end of the decade, however, the situation rapidly took a turn for the worse. Depending on the circumstances and the type of criminal organization you're dealing with, the criminal element is seldomly known for sticking to agreements and alliances, especially when there's changes in leadership, shifting interests, and new opportunities on both ends. Within the network of alliances they worked so hard to create, dissolving before them, leaders and decision makers with the various Mongols chapters soon faced a humiliating defeat. As the 1990s rolled around and casualties further mounted, the Mongols were once again forced to lower their standards. Having nowhere else to go, the group began pursuing untraditional recruiting practices by recruiting directly from both current and former street gangs. All throughout the Los Angeles area, they started recruiting common street criminals, most of whom had never owned or let alone rode a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. These were sureños, straight from the hood. Some of them were homeboys who they had grown up with. Others were friends who they had known from the streets. But either way, a huge influx of sureño street gang members were being brought in from Southern California. And along with these sureños came the inauspicious ties to the Mexican Mafia. It's called a package deal. You get one, you get the other. An unforeseeable circumstance that comes into play whenever you recruit active sureño gang members into whatever field you're talking about. We see the same kind of issues in the rap industry all the time. Certain producers are leery about signing sureño rappers because of the political baggage they bring with them, more specifically speaking, the Mexican Mafia. Regardless of their affiliation with the MC like the Mongols, they would still technically be expected to pay tribute to the Mexican Mafia. Nothing could ever interfere or get in the way of this, as this would always be a superseding obligation. This raised a lot of other problems, both on the streets and in the prison system. In essence, they would be dedicating their allegiance to two different criminal organizations. Then the defining question would be, which of these two organizations would take precedent over the other if they entered the prison system? One that was tied to ethnicity, territory, and their backgrounds as sureños, or the other that was tied to their simple preference when it came to MC. That put a lot of these prospective Mongols members in a precarious position. But the even bigger question is how the Mexican Mafia felt about this themselves. This is actually where the Mongols' problems with the MA first started. Even though the Mongols are an MC and they theoretically operate a little different from street gangs and prison organizations like the Mexican Mafia, they still understand the basics when it comes to politics and how they function. Obviously, things like no cooperating with law enforcement, zero tolerance when it comes to crimes against children, and the whole belief system when it comes to dropouts. This included those who had defected in prison and the MA's mandatory policy when it came to going after them. Then there's the typical loyalty that's afforded to all medals by the Sureño collective and those that are designated as camaradas. By bringing in these Sureños and all the political beliefs they carry with them, they were in essence also adopting some of their rules and their belief system as well. This put some of the prospective Mongols members at a serious set of crossroads, and it forced them to make some hard choices. they had to consider the fact that they might actually be putting themselves in situations where they'd have to renounce their allegiance to the Eme and risk persecution and assault as a result, or to just opt out and stay loyal to their fellow Sureño brothers. Whether it was predicated on these specific issues or other impediments, rifts within the Mongols began to form, some of which would last well into the 21st century. The conflict continued to escalate as internal politics within the Mongols grew more intricate. To make matters worse, the Eme had already started to identify certain aspects to be troubling when it came to the relationship between the Sureños that were aligning themselves with the Mongols, and they weren't in favor of it. They tolerated it, but they didn't like the fact that some of those lines were being blurred and that the Mongols were openly promoting it. However, things would end up taking a drastic turn for the worse, and this would force even some of those considered to be some of the hardliners to pick and choose sides. In January of 2004, the conflict between the Mexican Mafia and the club eventually ignited into an all-out full-fledged war. While on an annual motorcycle run in Arcadia, California, the Mongols had also made tentative arrangements to meet up and buy methamphetamine wholesale from a gang known as Basset Grande. The Mongols and members from the Basset Grande gang had conducted business several times in the past and agreed to meet at one of the local motels that was right off the freeway. After the transaction, the Basset gang members invited the Mongols to party with them at the motel that they had used for the deal. There were a total of 5 to 6 Mongols who were originally acting as security for the deal. These same 5 to 6 Mongols then accompanied the drugs and their buyer back to a Mongol safe house that was nearby. However, only 4 of them decided to return and go back to the Basset party. It was then at this point that things started to take a turn for the worse. One of the Mongols' security team was a former member of one of LA's biggest gangs, 18th Street. As was the case with a lot of other Mongols, he claimed to be a Sureño prior to getting recruited into the Mongols MC. However, members of the Basset gang ended up recognizing this Mongol as a former Sureño who was on the Mexican Mafia's green light list. He had been placed on this list for some type of misconduct or for breaking their code of conduct. These Basset gang members didn't have a copy of the green light list, but a couple of them knew who he was and had committed it to memory. This is common. A lot of times when you see one of these lists that are usually circulated in prison or in the county jails, you'll make mental notes of certain individuals that are documented on there, and you'll remember this. The NF has its own policies and methods for dealing with those who are documented on the BNL's bad news list, and the MA has policies as well. Sureños are required by the Mexican Mafia to kill anyone on the list if and when the opportunity presents itself. When this former 18th Street gang member was confronted by the Basset gang members, he went to the bathroom and came out wearing a pistol in plain view on his waistband. This was obviously a scare tactic, but the Basset gang members weren't impressed. As a Mongol, he was expected to represent the Mongols and stand up to these guys. This is a clear example of why the MA wasn't in favor of Sureños being recruited by the Mongols. Because in situations like this, those loyalty lines would often become blurred and their allegiance would come into question. Needless to say, the Mongol refused to leave the party after he was confronted, and he counted on his fellow Mongols to back him up. Left with no other choice but to fulfill their obligations, the Basset gang members ended up rushing him in force. In the struggle, the 18th Street Mongol was killed, and another Mongol who stayed to defend his comrade was badly injured. The other 2 Mongols who were there hit the burners and ran away. Later on, the Mongols would hold court for the 2 cowards and punish the 2 who ran. But things continued to escalate as these events were just the start of it. About a week later, on January 10, 2004, in the city of Rosemead, members from another Sureño street gang, Barrio La Sangra, had set up a methamphetamine lab in a motel room and started doing business. During that same week, there was another motorcycle run going on, and several Mongols had checked into the same motel. One Mongol from the San Jose area, who still openly identified himself as having ties to being a Norteño, walked past the open meth lab room and started asking questions. The Sangra gang members who were cooking meth in this room apparently left the door cracked open to help circulate the air. It was at this point, over the next hour or so, that several verbal confrontations occurred between the Mongol Norteño and the Sangra Sureños. Whether it was a result of the confrontation or if they were just there on a routine patrol, a Los Angeles Deputy Sheriff's Patrol unit arrived and started scanning the motel's parking lot. The presence of this patrol unit caused the Sangre gang members to start breaking down the meth lab and loading the equipment up into their cars. By this time, the Sangre gang members were upset, not only because of the presence of this patrol unit, but also because of this Mongol Norteño who continued to openly disrespect them. Unconcerned by the Sangre gang's warnings, the Mongol confronted these guys again in the parking lot, claiming not only to be a Mongol, but a Norteño as well. It was at this point that the Sangre gang members got tired of this guy's shit. They were already upset about losing their badge and for having to pack everything up the way they did. As the Sangre gang members were getting into their cars to leave, they ended up shooting and killing the Mongol Norteño for disrespecting them and for continuing to call them out. Responding deputies later caught the fleeing Sangre gang members, and as a result, a good issue of weight and equipment was seized. These two killings sparked a series of retaliatory strikes that went back and forth. Mongols were attacked at multiple locations, including a meth lab in Rosemead and motels all throughout LA. Bodies were dropped on both sides.